It's the 75th anniversary of one of the most famous fishing lures ever invented, the soft plastic worm. Hey folks, and welcome to the shop. My name's Sean, and this is a series where we just sit out here in my shop and talk about stuff I've collected over the years. I'm not an expert about anything, but I do like to read up on the stuff that I like. And tonight we're going to talk about Creme soft plastic worms. Flashback to 1949, Akron, Ohio. Now, if you watched any of my previous episodes, you know that part of Ohio and on up into Michigan, and then, the whole lower region of the Great Lakes there was the epicenter of fishing inventions. It was the epicenter of all kinds of inventions at that time because the auto industry was getting started up there. There were chemical manufacturing companies. DuPont was there. Goodyear was there. A lot of inventions going on. Well, there's a family there named Nick and Cosma Creme who lived in Akron. And Nick was not a highly educated man. He dropped out of high school after his sophomore year to help take care of his family. Married Cosma and settled down in Akron. And they loved to fish. And they fished mostly with night crawlers. Well, it's not easy to get night crawlers in the winter in Akron, Ohio. If you've ever hunted night crawlers before, well then you got to go out on a real dark, rainy night, and they lay out on the ground. You got to catch them. You can catch a bucket full, but it's hard to do, and there's only certain times you can do it, obviously. So they wanted to come up with a plastic or a rubber version. They experimented with some rubber and couldn't come up with anything. But plastics were just starting to come out, so Nick took a trip down. He had been, going to the library and stuff and reading all he could. He was really had a strong avocational interest in chemistry. And he talked to one of the engineers at DuPont, and they gave him a few things to try, and he brought it back, and he and Cosma cooked up some stuff using the pots in the kitchen, and finally came up with a concoction that they thought would work. It was something that, they thought wouldn't get too hard in the wintertime and wouldn't get too soft in the summertime and would work out, good for a plastic worm. Now, if you've ever poured soft plastics, and I have, and maybe some of you have, you know that there's two things about it. One is it stinks. I mean, it's terrible. I remember walking in my dad's shop when I was a kid, and it was just be smoky as can be because of all those worms. He was pouring worms, and I couldn't stand it. As a kid, I don't know how he stood it. And another thing you'll know about it is if you ever drip some on you, you just might as well, quit right then because it's going to hurt. Because that stuff don't cool off easy, and it'll burn through your skin all the way down to your bone if you don't get it off. So it's kind of rough. But Cosmo let him mix them up in the kitchen there, but he had to take them to the basement to pour them, and he made his own mold out of a real night crawler, and they poured them. And they took them out to the river and tried them out, and they worked. They caught bass, and so they decided they was going to try to sell them. So they took out an ad in Field and Stream magazine, and sure enough, people bought them. Now, most of the first people that bought them wasn't buying them for fishing. They were buying them just for the novelty of it. You could take that plastic worm and put it in a salad or something or under somebody's pillow. And probably somebody's still doing that today. And it was a novelty, but they started catching on with fishermen. Now you notice when they rigged them up, they had 3 hooks in them. All of them come like that, and they had some spare worms, but the rig itself had 3 hooks in it. And that's because that's the way they rig night crawlers. A lot of bass fishermen will rig night crawlers that way to this day, and they catch fish because no matter where the fish hits the worm, they're probably going to find a hook. But on the other hand, they're real bad to get hung up. And that's a disadvantage of it. Okay, let's flash forward 10 years to 1959 and move down to Tyler, Texas. Tyler, Texas is famous for 2 things. The first is its roses, and the second is its fishing. They have a rose garden in Tyler, Texas that's over 14 acres and has over 50 different varieties of roses. I looked it up. And they're known as the rose capital of the world. They have a rose festival. They crown the rose queen. They've got all kinds of stuff going on there about roses. They're serious about their roses in Tyler, Texas. Another thing they're famous for is fishing because they got a good lake there, Lake Tyler. So Lake Tyler was built about the time all the other courts of engineer lakes were built, the TVA lakes, They were damming up just about every stream they could find in the 1940s and 50s. And so they built Lake Tyler. So by 1959, it had grown up around the edges, with vegetation and stuff. And for whatever reason, the engineers who built that lake, they just sawed down the trees and piled them all up on what had become the lake bottom. So there's a lot of submerged timber there. Well, the bass, of course, love submerged timber. Any kind of fish does, but they couldn't fish it good because all they had were, either wooden lures or maybe a few plastic lures coming out by that time, and spoons, and different stuff like that were going to get hung up in those timber piles that were underwater. But so this feller from Tyler, Texas, and we don't know his name, nobody does, it's a mystery, come up with a way to rig a worm that could fish those underwater submerged timber piles. And you probably know what it is. It's called a Texas rig. Now, if you don't know what a Texas rig is, I'm going to show you right here, because there ain't much to it. So you just take your worm. It can be any kind of worm. This is just the first thing I grabbed. And you got a hook. Now, these days they make hooks just made specifically for Texas rigging, and the difference is the shape of the hook, and then it's got a little crook up here, and there's a lot of different variations on this too. But they all are rigged about the same way, and all you do is you just take your worm, and then you put that hook right through the nose. So just like that. So you just got a little bit, right? And then you slide that all the way up to that crook and turn it around. And then you're going to put your hook back through on the back side. And that hook, you run it through the first time all the way through, but then back it back into the plastic. And so there's no part of that hook that's outside the plastic. So you can throw that up into a cedar tree or whatever you want to, and it won't get hung up unless it wraps around the limbs or something. And you especially fish brush piles with it, or lily pads, or whatever you have to fish without getting hung up. It's a heck of a way to fish, and I still do it, and everybody else does to this day. Still a good way to fish is that Texas rig. Well, this fella in Tyler, Texas, invented them, and of course he was successful as can be. And so everybody in Tyler, Texas wanted a Texas rig. They wanted those soft plastics. So they went to the bait shop, and the bait shop sold out right away, And so the guy there wasn't but one person making these Creme worms, and that was the Creme family up in Akron, Ohio. So he wanted to get him some. So he set him up a long-distance phone call. And it wasn't easy to make a long-distance phone call back in those days. And so, what you had to do, you got to get an operator. You got to get on there, and you got to get an operator, and then you had to go over and get another operator. She'd plug in and get to the operator up in Ohio, and they'd plug in to the right line there, and then you finally make a connection. The operators talk to each other back and forth, figure out how much it's going to cost you, and it wasn't cheap. So over in the corner was a young feller who was kind of eavesdropping. His name was Wayne Kent. So young Wayne Kent, he was 16 years old at the time, doing the same thing that I did when I was 16 years old, working at a bait shop. He was counting out worms and minnows and sweeping floors and whatever, anybody could do at a bait shop to make a little bit of money when you're that age. And so he knew something was up because that long-distance phone call, because they were pretty expensive to do. And so he got to listening in on it. And the owner of the bait shop called to the Creme family, and Cosmo Creme answered the phone. So Cosmo Creme answered the phone, and he said, "Ma'am, I got something going on down here in Texas, and I need to buy as many as your lures if you'll sell me." And she said, "Well, I can't." And he said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Because for one thing, our lures are starting to catch on. We're back ordered for 3 months already. And for another thing, we don't sell to bait shops. We just sell to wholesale distributors. I can't sell them to you." So he asked her nice probably 2 or 3 more times, and she just wouldn't do it. So before he hung up, he said, "Well, ma'am, thank you. I appreciate your time. But by the way, I'm down here in the rose capital of the world in Tyler, Texas. And do you like roses?" And she said, "Well, yeah, I do. I like roses a lot." And he said, "Well, thank you, ma'am." And he hung up. Well, according to Mr. Wayne Kent, the 16-year-old that was listening in, 2 weeks later, the biggest old box of worms you ever seen showed up at that tackle shop. And when he asked why, he found out the rest of the story. So the next call that tackle shop owner had made after he hung up from talking to Miss Creme was to his buddy who lived down the street and sold rose bushes. And he said, I want you to send 2 dozen of the finest rose bushes of the most sought after varieties that you have up to Akron, Ohio, to the Creme family. And he did it. And then the rest is kind of history. He got the worms. Tyler, Texas became the Texas rig capital of the world, and everybody went there to fish just to see those Texas rigs. And became a really big story. Well, flash forward 10 more years, and the Creme family decided to move their business operations from Akron, Ohio to Tyler, Texas. I don't know, might have been the roses, it might have been the worms, it might have been the successful fishing, but for whatever reason, they wound up in Tyler, Texas, and ran a very successful business out of there, selling a whole lot of Creme worms. So they both eventually passed away after running their successful business. The family inherited it and they didn't have a whole lot of interest in doing it. So they needed to sell the business. Well, guess who ended up buying the business? That same 16-year-old that had been listening in on the conversation and learned a little bit about how business was conducted ended up buying the Creme Lure Company. And do you know the Kent family still owns the Creme Lure Company to this day, and they're still making those lures down there in Tyler, Texas. So I say support them. You know, that's a really cool story about a U.S. manufacturer that's still doing the best they can with what they got today. But that's not all the story, and there's a little bit more to it too. But first of all, I wanted to tell you thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you watching the shop series. We'll have another episode next week. And it'll probably be about fishing, but it might be about something else. You never know. But I appreciate you tuning in. Your likes and your shares are real appreciated. If you hadn't hit that subscribe button, go ahead and hit it now, because that just lets YouTube know you're paying attention. I appreciate that. And the other thing is, if you got any questions or if you got any suggestions, man, I got all kinds of stuff out here in the shop we can talk about. So it don't matter what the subject is. If you want to hear about something, let me know, and I'll try to cover it in a future episode. But anyway, I told you there's more to the story, and there is. So the Cremes invented the soft plastic lure 75 years ago, but they also invented something else that's been real important to fishermen, especially lately, and that is the concept of the influencer. Now, people have been doing that, with different various products for years, but the Cremes are credited with being the first ones to use successful fishermen to help market their lures, influencers of the day. And you know who one of the very first influencers that they got to help them sell their plastic worms was? It was a young up-and-coming fisherman from Lynchburg, Tennessee, and his name was Bill Dance. And that's another Shop Series episode that we'll talk about. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and I'll see you next time.